drive up the mountain was long, rough, and lonely. I had spent the better part of the afternoon maneuvering my truck along winding dirt roads, barely more than trails, carved into the deep forests of northern Montana. My destination, a remote hunting cabin I had rented for the week, far away from civilization. I needed the solitude. Life had been unbearable lately. Stress piling up at work, a nasty breakup that left me reeling, and a general sense of exhaustion from city life. This trip was supposed to be my reset button. A full week alone, just me, my rifle, and the wilderness. By the time I finally reached the cabin, the sun was already hanging low in the sky. The place looked exactly as described. An old wooden structure nestled between tall pines, a small porch with a single rocking chair, and a stone chimney protruding from the side. It was rustic, no electricity or running water, but it had a wood-burning stove and a functional outhouse nearby. More than enough for me. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the stillness around me. Nothing but the whisper of the wind through the trees and the occasional chirp of birds. Perfect. I grabbed my duffel bag and rifle, walked up the creaking wooden steps, and unlocked the heavy door. The inside was simple. One large room with a cot in the corner, a small kitchen area with an ancient wood stove, and a stone fireplace on the far wall. The air smelled of old wood and dust, with a faint, lingering scent of smoke from whoever had last used the place. Then I saw it. Leaning against the stone fireplace was a rifle. Not just any rifle, but an old bolt-action Winchester, its barrel still caked in fresh mud. My stomach tightened. I hadn't seen this in the listing photos. Someone had been here recently. I walked over, hesitant, and picked it up. The stock was scratched, the metal worn with age, but it was still a beautiful gun. The mud on the barrel was still damp. I ran my fingers through it. Whoever had left this here had done so very recently. I set it back where I found it, trying to shake the unease creeping into my gut. Maybe the last visitor had left in a hurry, forgot their gun. Or maybe the owner had been up here and left it by accident. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. After all, I was in the middle of nowhere. No one was out here but me. That first night, I settled in quickly. I gathered wood, started a fire in the stove, and cooked a can of stew over the flames. The warmth was comforting, the crackling of the fire soothing. After eating, I unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot and lay down, listening to the silence outside. No cars, no voices, just the wind. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. My fire had burned down to embers, the cabin swallowed in near total darkness. I lay still listening, feeling the cold creeping in. Then I heard it. Crunch. A single footstep outside, slow and deliberate, just beyond the cabin walls. My breath hitched. I lay frozen, my ears straining. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just the wind, whispering through the trees. Then, crunch, crunch. 2 more steps, closer this time. Heavy measured. I reached for my rifle, heart hammering. Was it an animal? A bear. No, bears didn't move like that. This was something, or someone on 2 legs. I eased up from the cot, as silent as I could, and moved to the window. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing in front of the cabin. I scanned the area, my breath slow, controlled. Nothing. Then movement. Just at the edge of the trees, something shifted in the shadows. A figure? A trick of the light. I gripped my rifle tighter, my pulse pounding. But after several minutes of stillness, I saw nothing else. No more sounds. No more movement. Eventually, I convinced myself it was my imagination, or maybe just an animal passing through. Either way, I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I went hunting. I needed the distraction. The morning was crisp, the air filled with the scent of pine and damp earth as I trekked deep into the woods, rifle slung over my shoulder. Hours passed, my boots crunching through the undergrowth as I searched for deer tracks. I finally spotted a buck in a clearing just after midday. I crouched low, raised my rifle, and lined up the shot. My finger tightened on the trigger. Then I stopped, because out of the corner of my eye, I saw something else. A figure, half hidden behind a tree, watching me from the tree-line. I swung my rifle toward it, my heart slamming against my ribs. But in the split second it took me to react, the figure was gone. I stood there, breathless, my skin crawling. I wasn't alone out here. I rushed back to the cabin as fast as I could, every instinct screaming at me to leave. When I arrived, I checked the door. Still locked. Nothing inside had been touched. Then I saw the footprints. In the dirt, just outside the cabin, a set of fresh boot prints circled the perimeter. The prints were deep, clear. Someone had walked around my cabin, more than once. My stomach twisted into knots. My brain scrambled for rational explanations. A lost hiker? A poacher? But why would they be watching me? That night, I barricaded the door with the chair and kept my rifle beside me in bed. I barely slept, listening to every rustle, every creak of the old cabin. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Crunch, crunch. Someone right outside the cabin. I gripped my rifle, holding my breath, willing myself not to move. Thud. Something heavy leaned against the door. I could hear breathing. Slow, deliberate. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the trigger. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but I was frozen, trapped in the suffocating silence. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the presence was gone. No retreating footsteps. No sound at all. Just silence. At dawn, I didn't waste time. I packed my gear, loaded my truck, and got the hell out of there. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the cabin one last time. And that's when I saw it. A figure standing just inside the tree line, watching me leave. I never went back. I never found out who or what was out there. And I don't want to. I never expected a winter getaway to turn into a nightmare. I had planned the trip for months, eager to spend a quiet weekend with my girlfriend, Rachel, in a secluded mountain cabin. The online listing showed a cozy, rustic lodge nestled deep in the woods, perfect for a romantic escape from the city. No distractions, just the two of us, a roaring fireplace, and a bottle of wine. It was supposed to be perfect. We left early Friday morning, Rachel in the passenger seat, her fingers tracing the frost on the window as we drove. The roads were clear when we started, but the higher we climbed into the mountains, the heavier the snowfall became. By the time we turned onto the narrow road leading to the cabin, the world around us was blanketed in thick, untouched white. The trees stood tall, their branches bending under the weight of fresh snow, and the silence was almost eerie. The cabin was smaller than I had imagined but charming, made of old wooden logs with a steeply sloped roof. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a welcoming sight in the frigid air. The owner had left the key in a small lockbox by the door, and we let ourselves in. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine and old wood, with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall. There was a small kitchen, a table with 2 chairs, and a bedroom tucked in the back. It was simple but warm, exactly what we needed. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, the wind picked up. Snowflakes swirled outside, the storm rolling in faster than we expected. We settled in for the night, cooking a simple dinner and sharing a bottle of wine by the fire. The storm didn't worry me at first. I had checked the forecast. It was supposed to snow, but nothing extreme. Then, at some point in the night, the power went out. The sudden darkness swallowed the room, and the only light came from the dying embers in the fireplace. I grabbed my phone, but there was no service this high up in the mountains. No power, no signal. Rachel sat up beside me on the couch, pulling a blanket tight around her shoulders. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I paused, listening. At first, there was nothing but the wind howling through the trees, but then I heard it too, a soft creaking, like footsteps on the porch. I stood slowly, heart pounding, and moved toward the window. The glass was fogged over, but I could just barely make out the outline of the front porch. Nothing, just snow piling up, covering the steps. "It's probably just the wind," I said, more to reassure myself than her. Rachel didn't look convinced, but she nodded. We locked the doors, stoked the fire, and tried to get some sleep. The next morning, I woke to a bitter chill. The fire had burned out, and the cabin felt like a freezer. I pulled on my jacket and boots and stepped outside, my breath curling in the air. That's when I saw it. The snow was deep, at least 3 feet, and completely untouched. No footprints, no tracks, nothing. But the strange part was the door. It was nailed shut. Thick wooden boards had been hammered across the entrance, trapping us inside. My stomach dropped. "Rachel," I called, trying to keep my voice calm. She hurried over, eyes wide with confusion. "What's wrong?" I pointed to the door. Her face drained of color. "This has to be a mistake," I said, grabbing at the boards. "Maybe the owner came by to secure the place because of the storm." Rachel shook her head. "Why wouldn't he tell us?" I had no answer. I went to the window, hoping we could climb out, but the outside shutters were nailed shut too. Every exit was sealed. My breathing quickened. "This doesn't make any sense," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "Who would do this?" I didn't want to answer, but I had an idea. Someone had been outside last night. The creaking we heard, it wasn't the wind. Someone had been walking on our porch. And now, in the middle of a snowstorm, we were trapped inside. We spent the day trying to break out. I searched the cabin for tools, anything to pry the boards loose, but there was nothing useful. The cabin was old, and whoever nailed the doors shut had done a damn good job. We tried breaking the glass in the windows, but the shutters outside blocked any escape. As the hours passed, the temperature inside dropped. With no power and no way to start another fire, the cold seeped into our bones. Our food supplies were limited, meant for a weekend, not a prolonged stay. Night fell again, and the fear crept in. I sat by the fireplace, clutching a kitchen knife, listening for any sound outside. Then it came, a slow, deliberate knock on the door. Rachel gasped, covering her mouth. I stood frozen, heart hammering. The knocking came again. Knock, knock, knock. I forced myself to speak. "Who's there?" Silence. The air felt heavier. Rachel grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. The knocking started again, louder this time. Then it moved to the window. Knock, knock, knock. The shutters rattled, as if someone was testing them. I swallowed hard. "Go away," I called out. Still no response. Rachel was shaking beside me. What do we do? I had no answer. The storm raged outside, the wind howling through the trees. We had no weapons, no way to defend ourselves. Whoever was out there had sealed us inside, and now they were toying with us. The knocking continued, circling the cabin. First the door, then the windows, then the back wall. It was methodical, slow, as if whoever was out there wanted us to know they had all the time in the world. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The night stretched on, the silence worse than the knocking. We barely slept, too afraid to close our eyes. When morning came, I gathered my strength. If we didn't get out soon, we wouldn't survive another night. The cold was unbearable, our food supplies dwindling. I grabbed the heaviest chair and swung it against the window, over and over, until the glass finally shattered. I reached through, ignoring the shards cutting my skin, and forced the shutter open. The wood cracked and splintered under my weight. Rachel climbed through first, then I followed. The moment my feet hit the snow, I turned to look at the cabin. My blood went cold. Footprints, leading away from the cabin. Fresh, deep footprints. Someone had been standing outside all night, watching, waiting. I grabbed Rachel's hand, and we ran. We never found out who did it. We reached the main road hours later, half frozen, and flagged down a passing truck. The police investigated, but the storm had erased any evidence. The cabin owner swore he hadn't been there, and there were no signs of forced entry. To this day, I don't know why we were targeted. I don't know who was outside, knocking in the dark. But I know one thing. They never intended to let us leave. I had always loved the solitude of the wilderness. There was something about being alone in the vast expanse of nature that made me feel truly at peace. So when I found an old logging cabin deep in the woods, miles away from civilization, I knew I had to stay there for a few nights. It was a simple structure, weathered wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a single room with a cot and a small table. The roof sagged slightly, but it was sturdy enough. The place had been abandoned for years, yet it felt welcoming in a strange way. The first day was uneventful. I spent the daylight hours gathering wood, setting up my sleeping bag on the cot, and making a small fire in the old fireplace. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly. I sat by the fire, sipping on a flask of whiskey, enjoying the deep silence of the forest. No distant cars, no hum of electricity, just the occasional crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind through the trees. It was perfect. At least, it was until I heard the first set of footsteps. They were faint at first, just a soft crunching of snow outside. I dismissed it as an animal, a deer or maybe a fox. But then they grew louder, deliberate, measured. Someone was walking around the cabin. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. I listened carefully, but the footsteps stopped just as suddenly as they had started. The fire flickered, casting long shadows on the wooden walls. I held my breath, straining to hear past the pounding of my own heart. Nothing, just the wind and the distant creak of tree branches. I shook my head, telling myself it was my imagination playing tricks on me. I had been alone in the woods before. This wasn't the first time I'd let paranoia get the better of me. But just as I started to relax, the footsteps returned. This time, they circled the cabin. I slowly reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, pointing it at the door. My mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker? A poacher? Or someone who lived in the area and didn't appreciate an outsider staying in the cabin? "Hello," I called out, my voice hoarse. Silence. I stood up and moved toward the window, peering out cautiously. The moonlight illuminated the snow-covered ground, but I saw nothing. No movement, no figures. But then my breath caught in my throat. There were footprints. They led up to the cabin, but didn't lead away. I swallowed hard, trying to suppress the panic rising in my chest. I checked the door. It was still locked. I grabbed my knife from my pack and kept it close. Maybe whoever it was had left quietly. Maybe the snow had covered their exit footprints quicker than I expected. I tried to convince myself of anything that made sense. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the old wood made me jolt awake. The fire burned low, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke up to the sound of footsteps again. This time, they were inside the cabin. I shot up, my pulse hammering. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the room was cast in near darkness. I gripped my knife tightly, scanning the small space. The door was still locked. The window was still shut. Yet the sound was unmistakable, soft, slow footsteps moving across the wooden floor. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice barely more than a whisper. Nothing. I reached for my flashlight, my hands shaking. I clicked it on and swept the beam across the room. Empty. The table, the cot, the fireplace. Everything was exactly as I had left it. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The layer of dust on the floor had been disturbed. A trail of faint footprints led from the door to the far corner of the room, then disappeared. I bolted upright, gripping my knife so tightly my knuckles ached. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I tried to make sense of it. The door was locked. No one could have gotten in, but someone had been walking inside the cabin. I didn't stay to figure out how. Throwing my pack over my shoulder, I yanked the door open and stepped outside into the freezing night. My boots crunched against the snow as I made my way away from the cabin, flashlight bouncing wildly in my trembling hands. I glanced over my shoulder once, just once, and what I saw sent me into a full sprint. The footprints outside the cabin had changed. The ones leading up to the door were still there. But now, there was a second set, and they were following me. I was the one who suggested we take the shortcut. It was supposed to be a simple hiking trip, 3 days through dense forest, crossing some old logging trails, and camping by a river before circling back. We had maps, a GPS, and enough supplies. There were 5 of us, me, Ryan, Joel, Aaron, and Sophia. All of us had hiked before, but none of us were survival experts. That didn't seem to matter. The forest was supposed to be safe. The shortcut was an old herding trail, barely visible under layers of dead leaves and overgrowth. It wasn't on our official map, but I had read about it in an old forum post from a guy who hiked this area years ago. It would save us a few hours, maybe half a day. Everyone agreed. We veered off the main trail just after noon. At first, everything was fine. The path was narrow but easy to follow, winding through towering pines and thick brush. Then, an hour in, the terrain became rougher, and the trail faded. The trees grew thicker, swallowing more and more of the daylight. Ryan checked the GPS. It had stopped working. No signal. That was when we started to get uneasy. Joel was the first to say it. "I think we should turn back." But by then, the way behind us looked just as uncertain as the way forward. The shortcut wasn't a shortcut anymore. We were just lost. We pushed forward, hoping to stumble onto the main trail again. That was when we saw it, just beyond a ridge, barely visible through the trees. A cabin. It wasn't marked on any of our maps. It looked old, forgotten. A single-story wooden structure with a slanted roof, sitting in a clearing like it had been dropped there by accident. The windows were filthy, the wooden planks weathered and gray. A strange relief washed over us. Shelter. A place to figure things out. Sophia knocked on the door. No answer. Joel tried the handle. Unlocked. Inside, the air was musty, thick with the scent of old wood and dampness. The furniture was basic: wooden chairs, a small table, a rusted stove. A single mattress lay in the corner, its stuffing spilling out like something had clawed at it. But what caught our attention was the journal. It sat on the table, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. Aaron picked it up, flipping to the first page. "I've been here for 3 days. I don't know how I got here. The woods change when you're not looking." A chill ran through me. Aaron kept reading. "It doesn't want me to leave. I walked for hours today, but every time I try to go back, I end up here again. I don't know if anyone will find this." We looked at each other. The silence was heavy. Ryan tried to laugh it off, but it was forced. "Just some paranoid guy who got lost," he said. "We'll find our way in the morning." None of us wanted to sleep in the cabin, but night was falling fast. We set up our sleeping bags near the fireplace, keeping the door locked. No one said it, but we all felt the same thing. Something was wrong. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. The cabin was dead silent. The others were sleeping, their breathing slow and even. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Just outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head slightly, careful not to make noise. The door had a small window, and in the dim moonlight, I saw a shape move past. A person, or something shaped like one. I wanted to wake the others, but I was frozen, listening as the footsteps circled the cabin. Then they stopped, right outside the door. A long silence. Then knock, knock, knock. Soft. Rhythmic. I didn't breathe. Didn't move. It knocked again. A whisper followed, just on the other side of the wood. "Hello." It wasn't a voice I recognized. It sounded wrong. Off. Like someone trying to mimic human speech, but not quite getting it right. Then the footsteps moved again, disappearing into the trees. I stayed awake until morning. I wasn't the only one who heard it. When we gathered in the morning, Sophia looked pale. "Someone was outside last night," she said. "I heard them walking. They were whispering." We decided to leave immediately. We packed our things, checked the map again, and started walking. But the forest had changed. The trail we came from was gone. The trees were denser, the undergrowth thicker. It was like the woods had shifted overnight, rearranging themselves. We walked for hours. The sun moved high in the sky, then started sinking again. We should have been near the main trail by now. But no matter which way we went, we kept passing the same landmarks: a fallen tree, a cluster of rocks, a patch of mushrooms. Like we were moving in circles. Then, as the sun began to set, we saw it again. The cabin, exactly where it had been before. Sophia gasped. No, we left it behind. But there it was. The same broken window. The same rotting door. And the worst part, the door was open now. Just a few inches. Like it was waiting for us. We had no choice. Night was coming, and we couldn't keep walking blindly. We barricaded the door this time, pushing the heavy wooden table against it. No one slept. Around midnight, the knocking started again. Knock, knock, knock. Then a voice, closer this time. "Let me in." It wasn't a request. It was flat. Empty. Wrong. Joel gripped the fire poker. Erin started crying, silently, her hands over her mouth. We stayed still, pretending we weren't there. The knocking stopped. But then something new. Scraping. Clawing at the walls. The sound of fingernails or something sharper, dragging along the wood. It circled the cabin for what felt like hours. Then silence. And then Sophia screamed. We turned to her, but she wasn't looking at the door. She was looking at the window. I followed her gaze. A face stared back at us through the glass. It was featureless, pale, with empty black holes where eyes should have been. It didn't blink. It didn't move. And then it smiled. The fire went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up to daylight streaming through the cracks in the wood. The face was gone. The cabin was silent. We didn't wait. We ran. I don't know how long we sprinted through the trees, but eventually the forest thinned. And then, just like that, we found the main trail. We never looked back. Never spoke about it again. When we got home, I tried to find records of that cabin. Old maps, forums, anything. It doesn't exist. No reports. No ruins. Nothing. It wasn't on the map. But somehow, it was still there, waiting for the next lost travelers to find it. I rented the cabin because it was cheap. That was the first mistake. I was looking for a place to get away. somewhere quiet where I could work on my novel without distractions. City life was wearing me down, and I thought a month of solitude in the woods would clear my mind. When I found the listing, a one-bedroom cabin deep in the forest, dirt cheap, I jumped on it. The owner, a man named Robert, barely spoke over the phone. He just gave me an address and told me where to find the key. "No service out there," he warned. "If you need anything, you'll have to drive back into town." I didn't mind. In fact, I liked the idea. No emails, no calls, just me and my writing. The drive was long. The cabin sat miles from the nearest town, surrounded by thick trees. The road leading to it was barely a road at all, just a narrow path of dirt and gravel winding through the forest. By the time I arrived, the sun was already setting, turning the sky a deep orange. I found the key under the old flower pot, just as Robert said. The cabin was small, just a single bedroom, a bathroom, and a combined kitchen-living area with an old brick fireplace. Everything smelled of damp wood. The air inside was stale, like no one had been there for a long time. I unpacked my things and set up my laptop on the wooden table by the window. The view was nice, just endless trees. Peaceful. That night, I slept soundly, listening to the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Everything felt fine. I woke up early, made coffee, and got to work. For the first time in months, I felt focused. Words poured out of me, and by noon, I had written more than I had in weeks. It was only later, while making lunch, that I noticed something strange. The loaf of bread I'd bought was open. I was sure I hadn't opened it yet. I shrugged it off. Maybe I forgot. Maybe I did open it, and just didn't remember. That night, I heard something moving inside the cabin. It was faint, a soft shuffling sound, like footsteps on wood. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, listening. The noise stopped. I told myself it was just the old cabin settling, the wind outside, maybe a raccoon on the roof. Still, I slept with the lamp on. The next morning, more food was missing. A whole granola bar gone. My water bottle, slightly unscrewed. I knew for a fact I hadn't touched those. I searched the cabin, opening every drawer, every cabinet. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I locked my bedroom door before going to bed. I wasn't sure why. Just a precaution, I told myself. Just in case. I woke up at 3 a.m., heart pounding. Something had woken me. A sound soft, close. A whisper. I sat up in bed, frozen. My breath caught in my throat. The room was silent, but I knew what I had heard. It had been right next to me, inches from my ear. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I decided to search the cabin again, this time more thoroughly. Under the old rug in the living room, I found it, a hidden door, flush with the wooden floorboards. My hands shook as I pried it open. A wooden ladder led down into darkness. A basement. But why was it hidden? I grabbed my flashlight and descended slowly, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, I found a small, cramped space filled with dust and old, rotting furniture. And then I saw it. A small cot, pushed against the wall. A blanket, wrinkled, as if someone had just been sleeping there. I backed up so fast I nearly tripped over myself. Someone had been living down here. Someone was still here. I ran up the ladder, slammed the door shut, and moved the heaviest furniture I could find over it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner, gripping the fireplace poker, staring at the door. At some point, exhaustion took over. I must have dozed off because I woke up to the feeling of cold air on my face. The front door was open, wide open. I shot up, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. My hands shook as I grabbed the fireplace poker. I stepped forward slowly, listening to every creak of the floor beneath me. Then, from behind me, I heard a soft, slow breath. I turned. The bedroom door was open, and in the darkness, just barely visible in the dim moonlight, I saw it. A figure. A man, thin and silent, standing in the doorway, staring at me. I ran. I didn't think, didn't stop, just ran. Out of the cabin, into the freezing night, through the trees. My car was parked down the hill. I ran faster than I ever had before, the cold air burning my lungs. I didn't stop until I was inside, locking the doors, fumbling for the keys with shaking hands. As I started the engine and turned the headlights on, I saw him, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. I sped down the dirt road, not stopping until I reached town. I found a motel and didn't sleep, just sat in bed shaking. The next morning, I called Robert and told him everything. He was silent for a long time. Then he sighed. "You weren't supposed to find the basement. I hung up. I never went back for my things. I didn't care. Let him keep them. Let him keep the cabin. I just wanted to forget that I had ever been there at all. I never liked the idea of renting a cabin in the woods. Something about being that isolated, that far away from civilization, made my skin crawl. But my friends insisted. "Come on, Mark," they said. "It'll be a fun weekend. Just us, nature, and no responsibilities." I should have trusted my instincts. It was a long drive to the cabin, 2 hours on the highway and another 30 minutes on a winding dirt road. Tall pines flanked the path, their shadows stretching over the road like skeletal fingers. By the time we arrived, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the small, weathered structure that was to be our home for the weekend. There were 4 of us: me, Ryan, Jessica, and Claire. The cabin itself was rustic but cozy, a single-story structure with a wraparound porch, large windows that looked out into the endless trees, and an old stone fireplace. Inside, the air smelled of pine and aged wood. It was nice, I had to admit. That first night, we sat by the fire, drinking and telling stories. The air was crisp, and the crackling flames filled the silence between our laughter. It felt normal, safe. Then, sometime after midnight, we heard it. A voice, soft, distant, calling my name. "Mark." The laughter died in my throat. I turned to my friends, expecting one of them to be messing with me, but they all looked just as confused. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Jessica frowned. "Hear what?" I hesitated. Maybe I imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Mark." I stood up, my pulse hammering. The voice had come from the trees, just beyond the edge of the porch. A whisper, but with an unmistakable familiarity. Like someone I knew. "You guys really don't hear that?" I asked again, my voice unsteady. Claire shook her head, eyes darting toward the darkened woods. "Mark, you're freaking me out." Ryan, ever the skeptic, laughed. "Dude, it's just the wind. Or maybe an owl. Don't let the creepy woods get to you." I wanted to believe that. But the sound, it was human. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I heard rustling outside the window. A slow, deliberate movement. But when I looked, there was nothing there. The next morning, I brushed it off as paranoia. Maybe Ryan was right. Maybe I had let the dark, unfamiliar setting mess with my head. We spent the day hiking, exploring the trails around the cabin. The deeper we went into the forest, the heavier the air seemed to become. At one point, we found an old, abandoned well, its stones covered in moss. Something about it unsettled me, but I kept my thoughts to myself. That night, we built another fire and played cards. It felt normal again, until it didn't. The voice returned. "Mark." This time, it was closer, just beyond the porch. I shot to my feet, heart pounding. "You heard that. You had to have heard that." Jessica's face had gone pale. "I heard something, but it didn't say your name. It was just a whisper." Ryan stood up, grabbing a flashlight. "All right, enough of this. If some creep is out there messing with us, I'm shutting it down right now." I didn't want him to go outside. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stop him. But before I could, he was already stepping onto the porch, shining his light into the trees. "See? Nothing," he called back. "Just you're overactive." A sound cut him off. A rustling, then footsteps, coming closer. Ryan's flashlight flickered. He cursed, smacking the side of it. The beam wavered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I swear I saw something move between the trees. Something tall. Watching. Then the voice came again. But this time, it wasn't just my name. "Come outside." The words sent ice down my spine. I backed away from the door, shaking my head. No, we need to leave. Now." Claire grabbed my arm. "Mark, what the hell is going on?" The voice called again, urgent now. "Come outside. Mark, come see." Ryan had enough. He bolted inside, locking the door behind him. "Okay, screw that. We're not staying another night. First thing in the morning, we're gone." None of us argued. We took turns keeping watch, too afraid to sleep. The voice didn't come again, but we could hear movement outside. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. When dawn finally arrived, we grabbed our bags and rushed to the car. As Ryan started the engine, I made the mistake of glancing back at the cabin one last time. There, standing just inside the tree line, was a figure. I couldn't make out its face, but it was watching us. And I swear, I saw its lips move, saying my name. Ryan floored the gas, and we didn't stop until we were miles away. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. But sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet, I swear I still hear it, calling my name. I had booked the cabin for 3 nights. It was the kind of remote getaway I needed, deep in the woods, away from people, noise, and responsibilities. The drive had been long, the roads winding and empty for miles before I finally reached the place. It was a modest structure, built decades ago, nestled between towering pines. No electricity, no cell signal, just a wood stove, a bed, and a lantern. Exactly what I wanted. I spent the first day hiking, exploring the vast stretch of land surrounding the cabin. The air smelled fresh, untouched by city fumes. By nightfall, I built a fire in the stone fireplace and let the warmth seep into my bones. It was peaceful, until I woke up in complete darkness. At first, I thought my lantern had simply burned out, but when I reached for my phone, the screen remained black. Pressing the power button did nothing. That was strange, but not alarming. I had left it on airplane mode the previous night to conserve battery. Maybe it had died. Then I noticed something else. The fireplace wasn't emitting any light. The embers should still have been glowing faintly, but I couldn't see them at all. I waved a hand in front of my face, nothing. The kind of darkness I was experiencing wasn't normal. I groped blindly for my backpack, searching for my flashlight. When I clicked the switch, it too refused to turn on. My pulse quickened. I had extra batteries, but without light, I couldn't change them. Then came the silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of everything. No wind, no rustling trees, no distant hoot of an owl. I had never encountered silence so complete. My own breathing felt intrusive. I swallowed hard. Maybe it was just a power failure, a weird total blackout that had affected my electronics. But the sun should have been rising. Even with thick clouds, there would be some level of ambient light. I reached toward where I remembered the window being. My fingers met cold glass, but beyond it, nothing. No outline of trees, no dull glow of early morning. Just void. I turned toward the door. If something had happened, an eclipse, or some bizarre natural event, I needed to step outside and see. I groped along the wall until I found the knob and twisted. The door didn't budge. I pushed harder. Still nothing. It wasn't locked. It felt as if something heavy was pressed against it from the other side. Panic crept into my chest. I took a deep breath, forced myself to think. The cabin had another exit, the small back door leading to the woodshed. I stumbled toward it, my hands outstretched, my toes scuffing against the wooden floor. When I reached the second door, my stomach dropped. It wouldn't open either. This time, I slammed my shoulder against it, desperation replacing logic. The wood didn't give an inch. I was trapped. A faint sound broke the silence. A soft, distant scraping. It came from the window. I froze. It was slow, deliberate, like fingernails dragging against the glass. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to tell myself it was a branch, but the motion was too controlled. I backed away, heart hammering. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe someone was outside. Maybe they could help. But as soon as the thought formed, dread coiled in my gut. Why wouldn't they say something? Why wouldn't they knock? I pressed my back against the wall, forcing myself to stay quiet. The scraping continued, steady, rhythmic. Then, without warning, it stopped. Silence returned. I didn't move. I strained to listen, my heartbeat thunderous in my ears. Then came the whisper. It was so faint I almost thought I imagined it. A single word. My name. A chill spread through my body. My name. Not a generic call for help, not an accidental sound. My name. I swallowed hard, gripping the strap of my useless flashlight as if it could protect me. I wasn't alone. Something was out there, or worse, something was in here with me. I didn't dare speak. I didn't dare move. My breaths were shallow, controlled. If I made a noise, would it answer? Would it come closer? I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed. Time lost meaning in the dark. Then a soft creak. Not from the window, from the floorboards. Inside the cabin. The sound was slight, but unmistakable. A shift of weight. A presence. I forced myself to stay still, every muscle locked. Another creak, closer this time. My hands trembled. The darkness was so absolute that I couldn't even tell where the sound was coming from. I needed to move. I needed to find a way out. With painstaking slowness, I crouched, feeling for something. Anything, I could use as a weapon. My fingers brushed against cold metal. My pocket knife. I clenched it in my fist. It wasn't much, but it was something. Another creak. A whisper of breath, impossibly close. I lunged. My knife met nothing but air. Off balance, I crashed to the floor. Pain jolted through my knees. My hand slammed against the ground, and I felt something. Something rough. Something fabric. A boot. A foot. Someone was standing right next to me. I scrambled backward, gasping, but there was no sound of pursuit. Just the boot, unmoving. My back hit the wall. My chest heaved. Then, suddenly, the darkness lifted. It wasn't gradual. One moment, I was drowning in blackness. The next, the morning light streamed through the windows. The fire was nothing but ash. My phone sat on the nightstand, powered on, displaying the time, 6:47 a.m. My flashlight lay on the floor, batteries still good. The doors swung open easily when I tried them, but the boot remained. It stood in the center of the room, worn, covered in dried mud. Only one. No footprints. No sign of anyone else. Just the boot. I left everything behind. My bag, my gear, even my wallet. I ran to my car, started the engine, and didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. When I told the cabin owner I had left early, he barely reacted. Just nodded and said, "Most folks don't stay the full 3 nights." I never asked what he meant. I didn't want to know. I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain what happened that night. I've told myself over and over that it wasn't real, that my mind played tricks on me, that exhaustion or paranoia got the best of me. But deep down, I know the truth. It was real, and I've never gone back to that place since. It started as a simple getaway. My wife, Ellen, and I had been arguing more than usual. Stress from work, money, the usual. We needed a break. A weekend away, somewhere remote, somewhere we could shut out the world. I found the cabin online. It was miles from anything, deep in the forested hills of northern Montana. No neighbors, no phone service, no distractions. Just a small wooden cabin with a fireplace, a well for water, and a propane generator. Rustic, quiet, perfect. Ellen wasn't thrilled about the lack of amenities, but she agreed. We packed light, just enough food and supplies for 3 nights, and made the long drive up the winding mountain roads. The deeper we went, the more the world seemed to disappear behind us. The last 30 miles were on dirt roads, the kind where you don't pass another car for an hour. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low behind the pines. It was beautiful, in a lonely kind of way. The cabin was small, a simple wooden structure with a steep roof and a wraparound porch. It sat in a clearing, surrounded by thick forest on all sides. The nearest road was a mile away, and even that was just a narrow, unmarked dirt path. As we stepped out of the truck, I felt it for the first time. That unease. Not fear, not yet. Just a quiet, nagging feeling in the back of my mind. The kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up, even when there's no reason for it. I shook it off. "Well," I said, forcing a smile. "Home sweet home." We settled in quickly. The inside of the cabin was small but cozy. One main room with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and a door leading to a bedroom with a single window facing the forest. There was no electricity, just a propane lantern and some old candles. That first night, we sat by the fire, drinking cheap wine and listening to the wind in the trees. Ellen seemed happier, more relaxed. But I couldn't shake that feeling. Every so often, I'd glance toward the window, half expecting to see something staring back at me. I told myself it was just my imagination. Still, before we went to bed, I checked the locks twice, just in case. The next morning was cold and gray. I stepped outside to gather firewood and froze. There were footprints in the dirt. Deep, heavy prints leading from the forest's edge to our porch. My stomach turned. "Ellen," I called, my voice tight. "Come look at this." She stepped outside, rubbing her arms against the chill. "What is it?" I pointed. Someone was here last night. Her eyes followed the prints. Maybe a hunter? I wanted to believe that. I really did. But the prints didn't go anywhere else. They came from the woods and stopped right at our front door. No prints leading away. Whoever had been standing there had never left. I spent the day trying to shake the unease. We hiked, we ate, we talked. Ellen convinced me I was overreacting. But when night came, that feeling crept back. We were sitting by the fire again, the lantern casting long shadows on the wooden walls. Ellen had dozed off on the couch, curled under a blanket. I stared into the flames, trying to quiet my thoughts. Then, out of the corner of my eye, movement. I turned toward the window. At first, I thought it was a trick of the firelight. A shadow, a reflection. Then I saw it. A face. Pale. Expressionless. Staring in through the glass. I jumped to my feet, my heart hammering. By the time I grabbed the lantern and swung it toward the window, it was gone. Ellen! I shook her awake. There was someone outside. She blinked groggily. What? Someone was at the window. I swear to God, I saw a face. She sat up, frowning. Are you sure? I grabbed the rifle we had brought, a small hunting rifle, more for protection against animals than anything else, and rushed outside. Nothing. No footprints. No sign of anything. Just the wind whispering through the trees. Ellen stood in the doorway, arms crossed. I think you're just tired. I wanted to believe that. But I knew what I saw. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, listening. At some point, Ellen rolled over and murmured, "You're overthinking it." Maybe she was right. Maybe it was nothing. Then, just past 2 a.m., knock. I sat up, my pulse slamming in my throat. Knock. Knock. Soft. Slow. Coming from the front door. I reached for the rifle, my hands shaking. Ellen stirred beside me. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded, wide-eyed. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then, a scrape, like fingers running down the wooden door. I swallowed hard. Whoever was out there wasn't leaving. We waited. Minutes passed. Then, as suddenly as it started, silence. I held my breath. The only sound was the wind. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At dawn, we packed. Ellen didn't argue. She had heard it too. We loaded the truck in record time, my hands still gripping the rifle. The whole time, I felt watched. The trees seemed closer, the forest quieter. As I started the engine, I glanced at the cabin one last time, and I saw it. A face. Pale. Grinning. Watching from the trees. I slammed the gas. We didn't stop driving until we hit the highway. We never spoke about it again. And we never went back. I needed an escape. My job, my relationships, my entire life felt like it was spiraling into a dull, suffocating routine. When I found the listing for a remote cabin deep in the woods, it seemed like the perfect solution. Off-grid, no cell service, no distractions, just a week of solitude where I could clear my head. The drive took longer than I expected. The paved roads turned to gravel, then to dirt, winding through thick forest with no signs of civilization. By the time I arrived, the sun was already dipping below the treetops, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin stood. It was smaller than I imagined, a single-story structure with dark wooden walls and a slanted roof. A covered porch ran along the front, and a small chimney jutted out from one side. It looked old but sturdy, the kind of place that had been here for decades, maybe longer. The key was under a loose rock by the door, just as the owner had told me. Inside, the air smelled of pine and dust. The furniture was simple, an old wooden table, a single bed, a small kitchenette. But my attention was immediately drawn to the fireplace. It dominated the main room, made of rough stone, its opening wide and deep. A bundle of firewood was stacked neatly beside it. I hadn't planned on making a fire. It was early autumn, and the air was crisp but not cold. But something about the fireplace made me uneasy. The darkness inside it seemed deeper than it should be, as if the chimney stretched further than the cabin's height allowed. Brushing off my nerves, I unpacked, made a simple dinner, and settled in with a book. As the night deepened, the silence became almost oppressive. No cars in the distance, no hum of electronics, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply. I decided to light a fire. I crumpled some old newspaper, stacked the logs, and struck a match. The flames flickered to life, casting warm light across the room. Then I heard it, a whisper. At first, I thought it was the fire itself, the way flames crackle and pop, but this was different. It was distinct, layered, as if multiple voices were speaking at once, too quiet to make out words. I leaned closer, staring into the flames. The whispering continued, rising and falling in an eerie rhythm. Then, clear as day, I heard my own name. I jerked back, my heart hammering. The room was empty. The front door was locked. I was alone. The whispering stopped. I sat in silence, my skin crawling. Maybe it had been my imagination, a trick of the fire. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that exhaustion was making me hear things. The next day, I explored the woods, trying to ignore the unease that clung to me. The trees were dense, the paths overgrown. I found no signs of other people, no footprints, no abandoned campsites, nothing. That night, the temperature dropped even more. Hesitant but unwilling to sit in the cold, I lit the fire again. The whispers started immediately. This time, I forced myself to listen, straining to make out the words. They were fragmented, overlapping, but certain phrases stood out. "Help us. It burns. We are still here." A chill crawled up my spine. I grabbed the poker and stirred the fire, as if that would somehow silence them. Instead, the voices grew louder, more desperate. Then, in a voice identical to my own, the whisper said, "Why did you come here?" I slammed the poker down and stepped away. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. I was overtired, stressed, that was all. I refused to light another fire for the rest of the trip. The cold was preferable to whatever was in that fireplace. But on the fifth night, something changed. I woke up to the sound of movement. Not outside in the woods, inside the cabin. The fire was burning. I hadn't lit it. The room flickered with orange light. I sat up slowly, my breath coming in short gasps. The whispers were louder than ever, overlapping voices forming a low, urgent hum. And then, deep inside the flames, I saw them. Faces. Twisting, writhing, their mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes were hollow, black voids. One face pushed forward, emerging from the embers like a drowning man gasping for air. Its charred lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. Then, in a crackling voice, it spoke. "You must burn too." I scrambled out of bed, grabbed a bucket of water from the kitchenette, and hurled it into the fireplace. The flames hissed, sputtered, and died. The room was plunged into darkness. The whispering stopped. I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against the door, gripping a knife, waiting for the first light of dawn. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my things and left. I didn't even bother locking the door behind me. I drove straight back to town, heart pounding the entire way. Days later, I called the owner, needing to know the truth. When I mentioned the fireplace, he went silent. Then, in a hushed voice, he said, "You're not the first." I needed to get away. The city was draining me, work, traffic, noise, the constant pressure of existing in a space where everyone wanted something from me. So when I found a listing for a remote cabin deep in the woods, I booked it without hesitation. 3 nights of solitude, no internet, no phone signal. Just the sound of the wind through the trees, the crackle of a fire, and the stillness I so desperately craved. The host sent simple instructions. A key under the mat, a stocked fireplace, and plenty of food. No neighbors, no disturbances. Exactly what I needed. It was late afternoon when I arrived. The drive had been long, winding roads cutting through dense forest. The last stretch was little more than a dirt path, barely wide enough for my car. When I pulled up in front of the cabin, I let out a long breath. It was perfect, small, rustic, but well-maintained. Wooden steps led to a porch with a single rocking chair. The windows reflected the golden hues of the setting sun. I grabbed my bag and stepped up onto the porch, brushing away dried leaves. Bending down, I lifted the mat. The key was right where the host had said it would be. Simple enough. Sliding the key into the lock, I turned it, expecting the familiar click of the mechanism giving way. It didn't budge. I frowned, jiggled the key, tried again. Nothing. Maybe it was stiff? I tried turning it the other way. Still nothing. A sudden breeze rustled the trees around me, making the cabin feel smaller, more isolated. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching from the tree line. But there was nothing, just the woods stretching endlessly in every direction. I tried the key again. It fit perfectly. It should have worked. But the door remained locked. Annoyed, I checked my phone. No signal, as expected. I had no way to contact the host. I knocked on the door, just in case. Of course, no one answered. Taking a step back, I studied the cabin. Something felt off. The air was too still. The trees around me didn't sway with the wind I had felt just moments ago. The shadows cast by the setting sun stretched unnaturally long across the porch. I shook the unease from my mind and walked around the cabin. Maybe there was a back entrance. As I turned the corner, my foot hit something hard, another key, lying in the dirt. My stomach tightened. Picking it up, I examined it. It was identical to the first one. I hurried back to the door, this time slipping the second key into the lock. It turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, though the fireplace was cold. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. The cabin was simple, a living area with a couch and a small wooden table, a kitchenette in the corner, and a door leading to what I assumed was the bedroom. A single window above the sink let in the last light of day, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Something wasn't right. The room felt used. A book lay open on the coffee table, as if someone had been reading it. A half-empty glass of water sat next to it, condensation still fresh. The blanket on the couch was rumpled, as if recently sat on. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart beginning to pound. The host had promised the cabin would be empty. Had someone else been staying here? Had they just left? Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The key I had used to open the door was still in my hand. I turned slowly, looking at the door behind me. The first key, the one that hadn't worked, was still in the lock. I hadn't removed it, and yet the door had opened. I forced myself to breathe, to think logically. Maybe the first key was just a dud, and the second one was a spare someone had dropped. Maybe the host had been here recently and left in a hurry. But then why did it feel like someone had just been in this room? I shook my head and set my bag down. I was overthinking things. I was exhausted from the long drive. I needed to eat, unwind, and get some sleep. Everything would make more sense in the morning. I checked the bedroom, empty. The small bathroom, empty. The cabin was mine, at least for now. As darkness settled outside, I lit the fireplace and warmed up some soup from the pantry. The crackling flames did little to chase away the unease that had settled in my chest. When I finally went to bed, I locked the door. Both keys sat on the nightstand beside me. I barely slept. At some point in the night, I woke up to the sound of movement in the living room. A soft creak of floorboards. I held my breath, every muscle tense. The fire had died down, leaving the cabin in near total darkness. Another creak. Closer this time. Then silence. I reached for my phone, but the screen was black. Dead battery. My eyes darted to the nightstand. The keys were gone. A slow, cold realization washed over me. I wasn't alone in the cabin. The floor creaked again, this time just outside the bedroom door. A shadow moved under the crack of the doorframe. And then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. I had never intended to find that cabin. It wasn't on any map, and as far as I knew, no one had ever mentioned it before. But there it was, standing alone in a clearing deep within the mountains, its weathered wood and slanted roof barely holding together. I had been hiking for nearly 6 hours, following what I thought was an old hunting trail. The path had twisted and disappeared beneath overgrowth, but curiosity, or maybe stupidity, had driven me forward. The sun was beginning to set when I first saw it. The cabin sat at the center of the clearing, framed by skeletal trees that loomed overhead, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky. It was small, no bigger than a one-room shack, with a single wooden door and 2 narrow windows on either side. A stone chimney jutted from the top, though no smoke rose from it. Something about it felt off. But I was tired, and the thought of setting up camp in the woods with no shelter didn't appeal to me. I walked around the cabin, taking in its strange, abandoned nature. It seemed old, very old, but not completely neglected. The walls, though cracked and warped, still stood strong. There was no furniture outside, no signs that anyone had lived here in recent years. As I completed my loop, I counted the features again. 1 door, 2 windows. Simple. Stepping up to the entrance, I pushed the door open. It groaned on rusted hinges, revealing a dimly lit interior. The air inside was thick, stale, like it had been sealed away from the world for years. A single wooden cot rested against the far wall, beside an empty stone fireplace. A broken table with one missing leg leaned awkwardly to the side. There were no personal belongings, no decorations. Just a lifeless, forgotten space. I dropped my pack inside and exhaled. The place wasn't ideal, but it would do for the night. The door shut behind me with a dull thud, and I felt an uneasy chill creep up my spine. Shaking it off, I set up my sleeping bag on the cot and ate a granola bar in silence. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, an eerie sound in the growing darkness. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't settle. Something about this place gnawed at me. Around midnight, I gave up and decided to step outside for some air. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I walked out onto the dirt clearing, rubbing my arms against the cold. Then I stopped. Something was wrong. The cabin looked different. I turned back to inspect it, my breath catching in my throat. I knew for certain that there had been only 2 windows on either side of the door. But now there were 3. A third window had appeared where there had been none before. My first thought was exhaustion. Maybe I had miscounted earlier. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. I had walked around the cabin. I had checked. There had only been 2 windows. A chill settled deep into my bones, but I forced myself to remain calm. I needed to test it. Swallowing hard, I started walking around the structure again. 1 door. 3 windows now. I continued moving, my footsteps crunching in the dry leaves. When I reached the back, my breath caught in my throat. The door was there. A second door. Identical to the first. That wasn't possible. I backed away, shaking my head. This was some kind of trick, an illusion of the dark. But no matter how many times I circled the cabin, the reality didn't change. The layout had shifted. It was no longer the same cabin I had entered. Panic surged through me. I needed to get out of there. Grabbing my pack from inside, I rushed toward the tree line. But as soon as I reached it, a forceful wave of dizziness struck me. My vision blurred, and my knees buckled. I fell to the ground, gripping the dirt as nausea rolled over me. The world spun, twisted, and for a brief moment, everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on my back, staring up at the canopy of trees. The stars had shifted positions. My head pounded as I sat up, blinking through the haze. Then I turned toward the cabin. It had moved. It now stood at a different angle in the clearing. The door was no longer facing me. Instead, the structure had rotated slightly, just enough for the windows to be positioned differently than before. My heart slammed against my ribs. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. I staggered to my feet, gripping my pack as I backed away. But the moment I tried to step into the woods, the dizziness returned. It was like stepping into an invisible wall of nausea, forcing me to my knees. The message was clear. I wasn't allowed to leave. Terror gripped me. I was trapped. I turned back toward the cabin, and my breath caught in my throat. The door was open now, but I hadn't left it that way. Something was inside. A cold sweat broke across my skin. The clearing was silent, too silent. No wind, no rustling leaves. The night had frozen around me. Then, from within the cabin, I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak of floorboards, as if something was shifting its weight inside. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey. I watched in horror as a shadow appeared in the doorway. Tall, thin, unnatural. It didn't step out, didn't reveal itself entirely. It just stood there, watching. Then the door began to close, inch by inch, until it shut with a final, echoing click. I ran. I didn't care about the nausea, the dizziness, the way the world spun around me. I forced myself through the tree line, stomach twisting violently, vision darkening at the edges. I ran until I couldn't breathe, until my legs gave out and I collapsed in the dirt. When I finally looked back, the cabin was gone. The clearing was empty. Just trees and leaves and darkness. No sign of the structure that had been there moments before. I didn't stop. I forced myself to my feet and kept moving, stumbling through the undergrowth until, hours later, I found a real trail. A real path. By sunrise, I reached a ranger station and collapsed on the porch, gasping out my story to the bewildered officer who found me. They never found the cabin. No maps marked it, no records of it existed. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the slow creak of floorboards and see the shadow standing in the doorway.